Today I want to talk about something I've been collecting for a long time and thought I had my head around it, and then of course realized I didn't when I actually tried to do some real research on it. But it's the Mechanics Institute, which is indeed well known, started during the later years of the gold rush, existing today, where people play chess and other things. It's also got a very interesting library, and we had a few meetings there when Jason was able to arrange. So anyway, I'm going to talk about the expositions and the medals that were awarded there. So let's try a little bit of, to put it in perspective. And in 1854 in San Francisco, the gold rush was still going on, but the heyday was long since gone, and a lot of the easy gold had been taken out. The Comstock lode had not yet been discovered. That was not for another 5 years. And so a lot of miners were, basically coming out of the woods and back to the civilized world, which meant they were coming to the cities, which at that time was either San Francisco or Sacramento. And these guys were largely pretty much uneducated or unskilled, and didn't really have the kind of skills that were, get employment at this time. Because the economy still really in San Francisco really was only a one industry thing. It was basically, let's buy some gold from some hicks and sell it to some guys in suits in New York, and so this exporting of gold was the only game in town, really, or selling things to people who were in that business. And so there weren't many opportunities, and so there were a lot of, it was sort of obvious that there was a lot of problems and discontent. So they may have money from the mining, but they didn't have income, and so something had to be done. Now, coincidentally, at this time, there was this thing called the Mechanics Institute, and this started in Britain in the early 19th century. The first one, I think, was in Scotland in 1820, and these were establishments where working men could learn skills that were useful. And we have to understand that a mechanic in the 19th century was a larger definition than today. It was really basically anybody who was skilled and used tools. And so certainly an auto mechanic today fits that definition, but in the 19th century, it was a much broader category. So these mechanic institutes were happening across Britain and the United States and elsewhere in the Western world, and offered this kind of instruction, but it was more than that. It actually had cultural events and recreational opportunities, including playing chess. So in San Francisco didn't have one. In fact, in 1854, San Francisco didn't have a lot of things that you'd think a city would have, because at this point, it basically grew from nothing to a pretty good sized city in 5 years. And so a group of fairly well-heeled citizens in San Francisco gathered to form a Mechanics Institute, recognizing this problem that people needed work. And so from the history website of the Mechanics Institute, the stated aims in 1854 were to have a library and a game room, which is interesting that they would say that so early, and classes. And interestingly, it was supposed to be open to anybody, regardless of race or gender, although I don't think that was, actually really that true. But it was supposed to be inexpensive. In 1857, so really 2 years after the Mechanics Institute had gotten underway, they realized that they kind of needed to raise some money. Their dues were pretty low, and they couldn't really, maintain the institute at this level unless they had something else. And so other mechanics institutes had sponsored fairs, and industrial exhibitions is what this one was called. And so they decided to have one. And the stated aim really was to show off San Francisco in particular, and California in general, in that there was a lot of opportunity here. and the potential for even more. The exhibition was free. The money that was raised, the profits were garnered by both ticket prices, which were pretty low, 50 cents for a day, or a season ticket for the 20 some day, 21 days of the first fair were $5. And then concessions, selling things. And so they had 31 of these industrial exhibitions, these Mechanics Institute fairs from 1857. The last one was in 1899. And we'll see that they were sort of annual, but they weren't. There were years where they didn't have it for one reason or another. So I was going to go through and just show some of the buildings because that's kind of interesting. The very first one was a 20,000 square foot a pavilion that was special purposely built on Montgomery Street, downtown. And it was enlarged in 1858 for another 5,000 square feet. They put some wings on it. And it was only used for these two fairs. So I don't know if it was intentionally a temporary building, but it turned out to be. No, the next two were even shorter lived. For the third one, which the third fair in 1860, which was another 5,000 square feet, and then in the fourth one for 1864 and 1865, you can see again it's not every year. It was 1857, 58, now 60, now 64 and 65, and that was yet bigger, another 10,000 square feet, and unfortunately, so all the Mechanics Institute reports of their fairs are online, except for 1860. That one is lost, and so information about that fair is hard to come by. They built another one, which I think is on Union Square. It's what the picture says. I couldn't find a square footage on it. It was again used for only 3 fairs, and then torn down to put up a yet larger building. This, I think, is the inside of the 1865 fair from a stereograph. And you can see there's a lot of stuff going on. There's a fountain in the middle and various exhibits. This must have been taken prior to opening, or everything's neat, so I don't think it's closing. So it's a lot of stuff in there. And then the 5th pavilion was used for a whole bunch of fairs. And here's a photo of that one. And then the final one was a really permanent building made of brick. It took up a whole block between Larkin and Grove, Polk and Hayes Street. And it had, like I said, these industrial exhibitions were, or the institutes were more than just industrial stuff. They also had music and shows and things. And this building could seat 11,000 people, which made it the largest venue in the city. And this picture is kind of fun because it shows a cable car and some horse-drawn buggies and things. So that's kind of interesting, I thought. Here's an indoor picture of this one. This is a bit bigger. It has a couple fountains, but again, you can see the different exhibits that different exhibitors would have had. But in 1899, I think when I read the report, you can basically tell they're kind of burned out on the whole idea. They've been doing it now for 45 years, 42 years, and there are other competing fairs. Most importantly, the California State Fair, Cal Expo, which was at that time was the fair of the California State Agricultural Society. I spoke about that a couple of years ago and wrote some articles in the Metal Collectors of America advisory about their metals. And of course, the building burned in the 1906 fire, and that was the end of it. Although the fairs had ended 7 years earlier. So let's on to the metals. Now, there are a couple different types. I'm going to run through these with the dates and try to give some idea of how many there are, or at least how many were made. How many there are is a whole different question. And so the first one is an interesting piece. It shows a mechanic on the left shaking hands with some kind of a scholar or engineer on the right, and surrounded by symbols of California industrial kind of agricultural things on the right and industrial kind of things on the left, and a beehive saying labor underneath it. And the phrase on top says progress, genius, and invention, except the invention is misspelled because they forgot the N. This was designed by the Knoll brothers. There's no question of that. There's a receipt for both the Knoll brothers and Albert Kuhner, who cut the dies, the famous die sinker who sank most of the dies for California Gold Rush private gold coins. And so my census, or not the census, rather, reading the reports, you can see this is how many medals were awarded in each year. We don't know about 1860, but only 23 are gold. And I know that one exists because I saw it about 20 years ago. 168 silver, of which I only know about 4, 3 of which I've owned. I sold one of them. The other one is in the Mechanics Institute, and that's actually the first year, 1857. And then I've never seen a bronze one. So these are astonishingly rare. They don't appear particularly often in early. In fact, they don't appear at all in early auction records before the next type. And so this is the key, I think. You can see on the back it's awarded by the Mechanics Institute to a particular person. This one's for a steam engine, and it says San Francisco. And this one has engraved in it 1868, and sometimes they're stamped, I think. The second type was used for only 2 fairs, but I'm calling this one type 2A because it's going to be modified. And it's quite a bit different. It didn't have, Albert Kuhner wasn't involved, nor were the Knoll brothers. By this time, I think they were not that active. And instead of 2 men, representing mechanics and engineers, you have 2 allegorical figures representing industry and agriculture, with the Mechanics Institute building at the time in the background, and the seal of the city and county of San Francisco in the foreground, and then again surrounded by symbols of industry and agriculture. And this one was designed, and the dies were executed by someone called a card engraver. I'm not really sure what that means. The first set of dies he made failed when they were being hardened, so he had to remake them. And that's going to actually be relevant. You'll notice the reverse is rather simple. It just says premium awarded to, and then the space for the people, and was given only in the 2 fairs, 1869 and 1871. So there were no medals in the next 3 fairs in 1874, 5, and 6. And the situation gets a little complicated, and hopefully you'll bear with me, at the 12th fair in 1877. And some of this was some insecurity, I think, that the directors of the Institute felt, who had probably attended the 1876 Centennial Exposition in Philadelphia and saw the rather large and elaborate medals that were awarded at the national fair, and thinking that, well, these little tiny 45 millimeter medals we have are kind of lame. And so they commissioned a larger medal design. They first spoke to this guy, Alfred Stott, again, and his partner, Henry Mayer, but they couldn't actually manufacture a medal of 3 inches, which is the size of this particular medal. And so they had to contract someone in New York, and it's signed by them. You'll see this in a minute. But the other thing that's interesting about this fair is they increased the number. So instead of less than 100 awards, they actually made 300 awards. And here's a picture of the medal. All the ones in 1877 look like this, well, unless they're more worn. They're stamped 1877 on the reverse, and there's no information about who it was awarded to. And so in some sense, this is a somewhat common issue, although in this grade, they're hard to find. And like I said, there were 300 of this type, but it's going to get complicated, because in 1878 and 79, they didn't issue medals again. In 1880, there was pushback from exhibitors that we want our medals. And but the directors felt that making gold and silver at this 3-inch size would be too expensive. Well, somewhere along the line, for the small metal, the reverse die failed. Remember, I said the original set of dies failed when they were being hardened. Well, these failed sometime, I think, in 18 when they were first being used in 1872, and so they had to pay Albert Kuhner to make a new die, and then they use it again.
Real
Because these dies broke again. And so clearly Stott and his partner weren't very good at making dies. So here's type 2B, where the obverse is exactly the same. And but the reverse is considerably more detailed, and this was made by Kuhner. Now, again, confusion. It's hard to know how many were awarded in 1880. This is a 1-year only type. Type 2A was 1 year in those, or two of those, throughout the 2 years that I mentioned earlier. The records show that they ordered 323 medals in the following proportions: 36 gold, 187 silver, and 100 bronze. But the dies broke. We know the dies broke, and there are other parts of the reports that say there were 439 medals awarded. And so there's sort of a disconnect between medals ordered, or medals paid for anyway, and medals awarded. And then we're going to come back to that. So because the dies broke, they had to make a new medal. This one's a little bit larger. This one again was where the dies were cut by Albert Kuhner, and but they were apparently made by this firm Wenzel, Rothschild, and Haydenfeld in San Francisco, and this was used throughout a number of fairs. It's by far the most common of the medals, with almost 2,500 awarded. In fact, 257 in gold alone. This is a gold one from 1884. The original one in 1882 had 1882 engraved in the die. The following year in 1883, they paid Kuhner another $20 to modify the die so that they could have a little plaque, so they could engrave the date on it. And you can see that's how it's engraved on this one. You also may notice that underneath San Francisco on the obverse, there are some signatures, but there's also some kind of dye corrosion here. And only in 1882 are the signatures really, really clear. There was apparently some dye rust or dye breakage or something. And so all the later ones have that diagnostic. And here in this one, you've got an allegorical figure awarding other allegorical figures for the industry on the left and agricultural on the right. And again, more symbols of industry and agriculture, California's agriculture. It's actually a pretty spectacular medal in high grade and in demand. But if you have a Mechanics Institute medal, most likely it's one of these. They're not that hard to find. Okay, so let's go to some of the complications. So this medal is dated 1880. That's a time travel problem, because we know that they were made in 1882, but this was dated 1880. Now, the particular awardee, Mrs. Brusher, did indeed win a silver medal for her millinery goods in 1880. So as far as the only way that she could have gotten this is if she had been given it in 1882 or later. And I think this kind of explains the count discrepancy in 1880, is that, I'm speculating here, but I believe that the die must have broken somewhere before they had made enough medals of the earlier type 2B. And so they couldn't give everybody a medal. But then later, when they had this medal made, they could retroactively award the people that they owed medals to. That, some speculation there, but I think it explains at least that discrepancy. And again, a very attractive medal, I think. Okay, more complications. Remember the big metal, and I forgot to say this earlier, but let's talk about the artistry. You've got some representation of a Greek or Roman goddess awarding a laurel wreath to a mechanic kneeling before her, and symbols of industry and the seal of San Francisco here and California's bear. In 1885, the directors decided that the three categories, well, actually the five categories, which was gold medal, silver medal, bronze medal, diploma, and medal or certificate of merit, which we'll talk about later, they added two more. And these were grand silver and grand bronze. And so you got to remember each category, they awarded silver and bronze medals pretty much willy-nilly. They were doing hundreds, or yeah, hundreds every year in total. And so some categories had, 5 or 10 different medal winners. And so this was supposed to be the best of the best. And so despite what they had said before about silver and gold being too expensive, they did reuse these 1877 dies, and they made them in silver and bronze. And total over all these years, they awarded 183 silver and 109 bronze. So silver is a little more common than bronze, but both very difficult to find. And in this case, the awardee information is on the medal. In some years, it was all on the rim. The metals themselves are rather thick, 7 or 8 millimeters, so there's more than enough space to engrave on the edge. And then the date would be there. This particular metal has some information underneath, and then it's stamped 1889. These are much harder to find than the bronze 1877 metal because there's less of them. The silvers probably got melted, many of them at one point or another. You can see the years, they gave it in 7 different years. 1893 was the last year they awarded regular medals of any kind. Now there's a special medal as well, and this is hard to get a handle on. But in 1865, the directors added the Institute Gold Medal, and this was basically each of these medals, the Institute and Inventor medals. There was only one awarded in one of the classes, one of these two classes each year, some years, maybe every year. They didn't always talk about it. But in 1865, they instituted they put the Institute Medal, which was for the best display of California manufactured articles. And then a few years later, they added the Inventor's Medal, which was for the best and most useful recent Pacific Coast invention. Now, these award criteria did evolve over the years. This is the 1869 description. It's very unclear how many times they awarded this. Then some years when they didn't award the regular medals, they awarded these. And then in other years when they talked about the regular medals, they didn't mention these. So it's kind of difficult to get a handle on. And it's unknown what the designs were. Maybe they used in some years the standard medal and then just had, on the back engraved, this is the Institute medal or the Inventor's medal, or maybe they didn't. But Alan Weinberg has the Inventor's medal from 1888. And I did find in a newspaper account that the Institute medal looked exactly the same. And this is kind of an interesting piece. Obviously, could be unique. The reverse is all engraved, and with the particulars about this particular, Mariner's device. And on the obverse, at first I thought it was some sort of generic one, but then I realized that this shield shows the seal of the city and county of San Francisco. So it almost certainly was locally made. It's very high relief. I've not actually seen it in the flesh. This is a picture from the Newman Numismatic Portal. It would be really interesting to know if the Companion Institute medal still exists or if any other years exist. In 1913, so I mentioned in 1899, they decided that, they were going out of the business of fairs because it was so much work and there were all these competitors and, they kind of were burned out. but a group of businessmen, sort of trying to capitalize on nostalgia, put some money together to revive the fair as a commercial enterprise rather than as a money-raising uh, uh, effort for the Mechanics Institute. And in fact, there was no connection to the Mechanics Institute at all. And they did award medals. They're the same size as the fourth type. They're gilt silver, and I think silver actually, but I didn't have a picture of one, and bronze. And one of the themes of the Mechanics Fair's logos and publicity was Douglas Tilden's mechanics statue, which was erected in 1901 after the regular fairs had stopped. And again, this statue still exists. It's on Market Street, just down the street from where the Mechanics Institute is now, but there is no real connection between the two. Now, this fair was supposed to be, we're going to have it every year kind of thing, although I don't know why they were thinking about competing with the PPIE, but it must have failed or interest is lost because it only happened in the single year, 1913. And so this is the medal they awarded. It shows Tilden's statue on the one side, a ferry building in the background, and then particulars on the back. And this fair was officially called the Mechanical, Industrial, and Electrical Exposition of 1913. And usually it just has the name of the awardee and not what they got it for. These come in a nice box generally. Some other collectible things, numismatic collectibles from the Industrial Exposition I'll talk about now. In the 10th fair in 1875, a company called the Cornell Watch Company, which had relocated to San Francisco after their factory was burned in the Chicago fire of 1871, rented a large space where they had 12 guys working, showing how to make watches. And you could get this souvenir, the 30 millimeter white metal piece, with the Cornell Watch Company on one side and particulars about the fair on the other. There's a very good chance these were actually made on the premises, but I don't have proof of that. The following year, they realized that their location on Sutter Street wasn't optimal. I think there was too much fog, and so for making the precision pieces a watch would need, and they actually moved to Berkeley. Another piece in one of the last fairs is a so-called dollar, HK 641 at the 30th fair. The famous, die sinker L.H. Moisey set up a press making the aluminum, these large 45 millimeter aluminum medals featuring City Hall on one side, and then all of the particulars about the politicians and whatnot on the reverse. And these were made at the 30th fair in that 6th building. This particular City Hall is the one that burned in the earthquake in 1906. Now, finally, I want to talk about the diplomas and the certificate of merits. These things, so the medals are obtainable, and I have a bunch of them. There's some on eBay right now. The paper diplomas and certificates were issued in very large numbers, certainly thousands. But I'm yet to find one that's ever been up for sale. The only one I can find at all is in the Bancroft Library. There's a picture of it. It's from one of the first two fairs. And in the end, this was designed by Charles Knoll, who did a lot of the certificates. He did the Vigilance Committee certificate as well. They redesigned it a lot, trying to update it, I guess, and they were actually different for the certificates of merit than the diplomas. The diploma was considered a somewhat higher award. What happened to these? I mean, so clearly some of them probably burned in the fire, but you'd think that there would be some left, but I have not been able to locate any. So how do you collect these things? Well, like I said, I've been collecting these for a long time. My original rather crazy idea was I think I'd collect them by date, but I didn't know that they didn't have them every year. And some years they had a fair and they didn't award medals. And so, this is a list of all the fairs and how many medals I could ascertain were made for each of those. And so, clearly, your collection is more or less going to end in 1893. After that, there were some special awards made, with no particular details about, why they gave medals or special medals or what the design was. So you could collect them by type. That's probably the most straightforward way to do it. You'd have 4 different types from the Mechanics Institute, 5 if you add the 1913 not official fair. You could also collect them by awardees, interesting awardees. The reason that I saw that type 1 in gold was because it was from the California Powder Company. Ron Lurch had offered it to me. I should have bought it, but I didn't 25 years ago or more. And the reason it was expensive at the time was because it was from a powder company. And of course, collect them any way you want because, it's your collection. You can do what you want to do. So to close, the Mechanics Institute, established in 1854, was really, part of the effort to develop San Francisco as an actual city instead of just, a set of gold merchants, but also to aid, these guys coming in from the sticks. They had 31 of these industrial exhibitions, and they showcased California, but also other places in the Western United States, how their industries and agriculture. Many of these fairs awarded premiums, which could be medals, diplomas, or cash, but not all of them, not all the fairs did. Although it seems that the horticulture people always awarded something, and if there weren't medals, they usually gave cash prizes. They seem to be well funded. Like I said, there were 4 major design types and 1 bonus fair medal. And here they are again, the 4 types. Type 1 on the upper left, type 2 on the upper right, type 3, the large medal in the lower left, and finally the most common medal, type 4, in the lower right. So thank you very much. I can take questions. There are any.
Thank you, Michael.
Yeah, thank you.
I actually have a couple of little side stories involving the Mechanics Institute since I used to work in that building. And I, of course, then had to find out everything about it. Back when the Mechanics Institute was founded in San Francisco, there was a rival group called the Merchants Institute. And the competition was between who would have the best library between the two of them. The Mechanics Institute, as you could tell, was run fairly conservatively, whereas the Merchants Institute got involved in lotteries, their own internal lotteries. And so they went bankrupt and ended up selling their library to the mechanics. That was shortly before 1906 earthquake, and everything was burned and lost in the earthquake and fire. But the best part of it was that their mechanics pavilion was, as Michael said, located between Larkin and Polk and Hayes and Grove. And if you know where that is now, that is where the Civic Auditorium is. And the city bought the land from the Mechanics Institute, and that provided enough money for them to build their building and restock their library. So that's my thing about the mechanics.
Well, thank you. I had read about the merger of the 2 libraries. I didn't realize the particulars about one being bankrupt.
Yes, yes.
Michael,
Anyway.
Michael, one quick question or observation, however you want to say it. On the type 1, where the gentleman on the right is holding the scroll, at
Yes.
his left elbow looks suspiciously like a water cannon for mining gold.
Very possible. Let's take a closer look at that one. Which one are you referring to? The guy holding the diploma thing?
Above the cage, just by his elbow.
Oh, yeah. You're right. Undoubtedly.
Pivot.
Yeah. So that's not just, there's also, some art stuff here. There's a lyre and some, and a sculptor and some kind of cage. I don't know what that is.
I don't know either. I know the water cannons on the pivot based on the big concrete blocks were really common up in the gold country back shortly before that time anyway.
Yeah, around, the early guys, they were up there with pans, but yeah, by 1857, they were more mechanized for sure.
And those water cannons, those were called monitors, I believe, weren't they?
Yeah, they were called cannons and monitors both. It depends on sort of who was making them at the time. The main thing is you can see when you go up Route 80, when you go past Auburn, before you get to Colfax, on the left-hand side, you can see a solid wall that goes up about 80, 90 feet. That's all river rock. That is the finish point of the water cannon that leveled that whole set of hills all the way back down to the valley. So when you're going by that and you see all that river rock on that big hillside, you can look to the right and see how flattened it out actually became after the water cannons leveled it.
Yeah, they were pretty effective at destroying the landscape.
Which is why they were outlawed in, I think, 1894. I think it was the first environmental outlawing of any device.
Yeah, interestingly, the main reason they outlawed them wasn't because they were leveling the land. They were outlawing them because they used giant sheets of mercury to capture the gold as it ran off down through the slough off of the water cannon. And those large sheets of mercury used to collapse and go into the rivers. So eventually they figured out that wasn't a good idea.
Yeah,
Indeed not.
indeed. Any other
Talking
questions?
talking about destruction, you mentioned that all these buildings that were put up early on, in particular, were made to be disposable. I guess in some regards, and that.
Well,
is
I
what
guess they
found.
must have been. They must have been.
Yeah, that's what I found when I was looking at the fair in Omaha and the other ones. Is they seem to be made to be knocked down, and it kind of blows my mind they put up such seemingly elaborate buildings just to tear them down a year or two later.
Yeah, well, fair buildings were usually made of plaster and some wood, but a lot of it was plaster that could be easily torn down.
If you look at the first or second one that you had, Michael, you can see that it's got busted joints holding up the walls. So they were tilt-ups basically that could be folded back down. See the one on the bottom of that picture?
Yeah.
Yeah.
The walls are buttressed up.
Ah, yes. Yeah, that one was only used for 2 fairs. And then they put up this more permanent one. Yeah, this one. Oh no, this one was more permanent.
Yeah, those are wood.
Yeah. Then this one was brick or well, maybe it was wood. I don't know. But this one was up for, well, from 1882 to burned in 1906.
Cool.
Michael, maybe the paper is scarce because people don't really know what it means when it says diploma.
Yeah, I mean, metal is, the reason why we collect metals and coins and things, because it's, it's tactile. The diploma, for one reason or another, they're probably out there. It may be that, people don't recognize their value. My guess is that in the right auction, one of these things would do very well because they're rare and the metals are pretty heavily collected at this point. They used to be relatively cheap, but they're not anymore.
Yeah, someone would have to know what they're bidding on in an auction. That's all.
Yeah, it'd have to be the right auction, obviously. But this is kind of interesting, it's got the building in it and, all this stuff. It's typical of Knoll's this was Charles and Arthur Knoll, who were artists on Broadway. Charles was more of a photographer and engraver, or rather, Charles was a painter, and Arthur was the photographer and engraver. And so it's likely that they probably worked together on this, with Charles doing the artistic bit on it, and Arthur actually executing it. Although we don't really know. A Charles Knoll painting, which are typically of Western scenes of this period, is easily a 5-figure item.
Well done, Michael.
Thank you.
Michael, did you come across any tie-in of these medals to the California State Fair medals?
Well, there is this connection. I wrote a rather lengthy. I wrote this article is my entry for this year's PCNS papers contest. And a few years back, I did one on the state fair, the agricultural medals. And this very first one is the year after the first medal for the California State Agricultural Society. And that one, I found evidence for the State Agricultural Society that they paid the Knoll brothers to design the medal. And so and in my article, I sort of jumped to the conclusion that the dies had to be cut by Cooner. And I jumped to that conclusion because of this case, where it's actually quite definitive, where we have itemized payments in the report to each of these guys. So that's the connection. And I probably should have put a picture of that medal compared to this one, and we could do some dissection about
That'd be interesting.
similar and how they're similar and different. That could be interesting.
I notice on this first medal, we were talking about that cage back there underneath the water cannon. I suspect that's a globe, just not well rendered, because the globe was a central device at the top of the diploma.
You're probably right. You're probably right. And it would be the kind of thing you would have, associated with, a sculpture and a lyre about, scientific and artistic kind of endeavors.
Do you have any idea why the bronze medals seem to be scarcer than the others?
Well, they generally didn't award as many. But this metal's so rare, it other than the one that's pictured on the Mechanics Institute website, I didn't see one for 15 or 20 years. And then oddly enough, I saw 3 on eBay, and I bought all of them. I sold one of them, trying to make tons of money, which I didn't, but because I'm collecting by date, and the other one I sold was also 1868. So I have 1865 and 1868.
Okay. Anybody else have questions?
Gold, not gold plated.
The gold ones are real gold, and not plated. Yes.
Nice.
And
Anybody else?
I have seen a gold one of these as well, or maybe this one. I'm not sure which one it was. So I know at least one gold one exists, which is kind of surprising, because you think about the price of gold, even in distant past. I mean, it was worth a fair amount of money. Even when they were awarded, it was probably more than $20 worth of gold.
Were you able to do any research on the award winners, and was there any tie-in to?
Oh, yeah, that's actually kind of interesting. Only one, and a guy named Huntington, and I should put that I should have put this in the presentation. So this guy Huntington won he won bronze medals a number of times for various mining kind of devices. And he exhibited at towards the end of the fairs. He exhibited at the Midwinter Fair in 1894, and these were all sold individually on eBay about 10 years ago, including his season's pass to the Midwinter Fair. So there's actually a photograph of that fellow. Sometimes there are other interesting ones. I have one that's really worn that was for a buggy company, and the companies, if it's a company, they're relative, and even the individuals are relatively easy to find in the business directories. But yeah, that would be another way to collect these, is by, interesting awardees.
Yeah.
Like I said, the California Powder Company, which was the type 1 gold medal and then a type 2 gold medal and some silvers, it has a crossover to people that collect things about mining and about explosives.
It'd be really interesting to see if any of these inventions or devices or whatever it was awarded for, became very commercially successful, and it's the genesis of some large company today. Because they all seem to be sort of one-off things you probably don't hear much about today.
There are some and I think I have one for sewing machines. That, where the sewing machine companies, evolved into some other, into Singer or something, or acquired by Singer, I think. And so, yeah, that would be another interesting rabbit hole to dive down into.
Yeah, it would be a rabbit hole.
Michael? Yeah,
Yeah.
the one on the upper right there, looks like it's awarded to a woman named Ida Fletcher.
Yes.
So there were some women who were being awarded for things, right?
Yeah, they were, typically, things you would associate with females, like flower arrangement, or the other one I showed that was awarded to a woman was for millinery stuff. So,
Is that what, yeah, this one to Fletcher, what's that about? I can't read it.
Yeah, I can't read it either. Oh, pen drawing, I think it says.
Oh, okay.
So it would have been, she would have done some calligraphy or something.
Yeah, right.
And so there were a lot of different categories, that range from, heavy industry to horticulture and agriculture to, the fine arts. And so,
Yeah.
and the women would often exhibit in some of those categories.
Yeah.
They probably didn't do too much in the mining category.
You notice in the 1877 model, the 1877 model's got a much more refined globe in the background by the lady's knee. So maybe Stephen's right about that first model.
Yeah, I'm sure he is. I'm sure he is. Yeah, there's a lot of stuff in these. I mean, you could spend a lot of time with a magnifying glass saying, "Oh yeah, there's this."
Yeah. Okay. Any other questions?
No, this was really good. Thank you.
Yes.
Thank
Thank you.
Well
again.
done.
Michael.
Well, thanks, guys. Be sure to read my article.